Don't worry about me. I'm going where I always wanted to go, and when I get there, I'll be saying a prayer for all of you.
Can one man change the world? Can one man change the world that he lives within? Can one man encourage a group of men to live extraordinary lives, not just in the moment he's in, but for generations to come? Those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as we begin this journey called Kapaun's Men. My name is Joe Ferris, and I'm going to be with you as a guide on this journey. And I want you to understand more than anything else, the journey itself starts with the idea of trusting the person leading us. That person's an Army chaplain. His name is Father Kapaun. Father Kapaun is a man that's touched lives for generations, not just the men in the prison camp in Korea or in his hometown of Pilsen, Kansas, but he's touched lives all over the country. And if I had to tell you as we begin the journey together, he's touched my life. There are places that I've learned more and more about Father Kapaun where I've felt that he almost reached into my life and spoke a truth to me as a man that's taught me to be a better father, a better husband, a better worker, and a better man. So I invite you in this 7 weeks to make a commitment, just as Father Kapaun was imprisoned for 7 months, that you take 7 weeks to put aside all the distractions and all the things that might give you reasons not to be here, not just for your family and for your children and for your community, but for yourself. Will you allow Father Kapaun, an ordinary man who did extraordinary things, to touch you and to encourage you and to take you deeper in your faith journey with God? And the question that I think we all have sitting here is, can one man change the world? We're sitting in a group of people, maybe the guy next to you, the guy across from you, the guy sitting behind you. Is it possible for one man to change the world? And not just the world around him, but potentially the world for generations to come. And I start the journey with a resounding yes. And I want to do that on this first little bit of time that we have together by introducing you to an extraordinary man who changed the world doing very ordinary things in extraordinary ways.
Emil Kapaun grew up during the Depression on a small farm near Pilsen, Kansas. Always known as someone who was willing to help others, young Emil did what he could to help his family survive on the flat Kansas plains. In high school, Emil Kapaun, who is also known as Father Kapaun to many in Kansas, began talking about becoming a Catholic priest, and his local priest, Father Sklinar, made arrangements for young Emil to study and eventually become a priest in the Diocese of Wichita.
According to my grandmother, yes, he always did. He always knew that that was going to be his vocation. Even when he was 4 years old, she always tells a story about how he would stack old cardboard boxes and old crates in the living room and drape a towel over the top of the crates and would be trying to say Mass. He'd even use the Latin words, even though he really wasn't sure sometimes of what he was saying. She always knew that that was what he was going to be. It was never a question in her heart, and I don't think it was ever a question in his heart as where he wanted to be and who he was going to be.
Emil Kapaun was ordained a priest in June of 1940 and was assigned to his home church in Pilsen, Kansas. It was during this time that he also began serving Mass for the soldiers at Harrington Air Base, which was close to the town of Pilsen.
It started giving him a bondship of what the guys in the military were, and I think he also saw that there was a lot of lacking for what any kind of spiritual direction they were getting, and I think that's one of the gaps he wanted to fill, and wanted to be one of the people that would help bring these boys back together and bring them closer to God.
The service to these men in uniform would lead him to enter the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps in 1944, and eventually to serve as a chaplain in World War II. In 1945, Father Kapaun was sent to India and served in the Burma theater. Men who served with him said that any time gunfire could be heard, it wouldn't be long before Father Kapaun would arrive by jeep or even bicycle to be alongside them.
The chaplains were never required to be up at the front lines. They were never required to go through the same training and the same work as the regular soldiers. But Father Kapaun was always willing to do that because he wanted to be with the men. because he knew they're the ones that needed him, and that was his purpose for being there.
Father Kapaun returned from World War II in 1946 and continued his education at the Catholic University of America, where he earned a master's degree. He returned home to Kansas and over the next year was assigned to different parishes before asking Bishop Carroll for permission to return to military service. Back in the service and assigned to the Army's 1st Cavalry Division, it wouldn't be long before he would ship out to Japan, en route to the conflict in Korea.
The communist-led North Korean army plunged across the line which separated it from free South Korea.
Father Kapaun was constantly serving the men in his battalion and was known to use the hood of his Jeep as an altar during Mass. Whether he was ministering to the dying, performing baptisms, hearing confessions, or offering communion, Father Kapaun stayed with his men. In October of 1950, Father Kapaun and the 1st Cavalry Division crossed the 38th parallel, the designated boundary of North Korea, and within a month, his battalion found themselves surrounded by a large Chinese and North Korean fighting force at Unsan, North Korea. The Battle of Unsan would come to be known as one of the most devastating U.S. losses of the Korean War.
That's when Chinese forces entered the war with a massive surprise attack. Perhaps 20,000 soldiers pouring down on a few thousand Americans. In the chaos, dodging bullets and explosions, Father Kapaun raced between foxholes, out past the front lines, and into no man's land, dragging the wounded to safety. When his commanders ordered an evacuation, he chose to stay, gathering the injured, tending to their wounds.
They said he had courage that you couldn't believe. When you was in a firefight or something and it was real hot and heavy, he'd be right out there getting the wounded and bringing them back. And he had 2 Jeeps shot out from under him. One of his drivers got killed and the other one got captured, I guess. And he never got a scratch.
If you would ask him today, I don't think he would even call it courage. I think he would just say, you know, the guys were out there that needed help and I went and helped them. I wasn't trying to be brave. I wasn't trying to be, I had all this gumption inside of me. They just needed help and nobody else was helping them. He was the one who always would do it first and doing it for their benefit and not for his.
When the enemy broke through and the combat was hand to hand, he carried on, comforting the injured and the dying, offering some measure of peace as they left this earth. When enemy forces bore down, it seemed like the end, that these wounded Americans, more than a dozen of them, would be gunned down. But Father Kapaun spotted a wounded Chinese officer. He pleaded with this Chinese officer and convinced him to call out to his fellow Chinese. The shooting stopped, and they negotiated a safe surrender, saving those American lives.
At the same time that Father Kapaun is working to facilitate the surrender of the men he was caring for, close by, Sergeant First Class Herbert Miller is trying to make it to safety when shrapnel from a grenade explodes near his feet and badly injures one of his ankles.
The bottom half of his leg from his knee on down was just in shreds. He said that he was bleeding so much. At first he thought he was going to bleed to death, but so he said he tried to stand up. He said he obviously couldn't stand up on his broken ankle, so he said he just laid there trying to decide what to do.
There was dead Koreans and Chinese there, so where I was laying, I pulled one of them over me. So I laid down there, and I had my arm up like this, and I could see that Korean's boot right there, but he didn't know I was alive. So pretty quick they took off. The Americans chased them out of there, and I just laid there till about, I guess, 2 o'clock in the afternoon or so. And I looked up a ditch, and here was a Chinese officer and a Korean. And the Korean saw that I was alive, so he come down there.
Finally, this Chinese soldier realizes that he's still alive, pulls the bodies off of him, and puts the rifle to Miller's forehead, and there was no hope.
And he stood over me with a gun pointed right at my head, and I figured to myself, well, this is the end of the road right here. And about that time, I saw this soldier coming from across the road there.
Father had already surrendered and was under guard and saw this execution about to take place. So he walked away from his own guards who could have shot him. He just walked away.
He come right straight to where I was, pushed that guy aside. Why that guy never shot him, I'll never know. The Lord must have healed him, because he bent over and picked me up and carried me.
He said, I don't have any idea how he was able to pick me up, but he said he picked me up, and he said he started to carry me.
And I hopped along on one leg, and him with his arm around me. And I found out then that he was a chaplain, and it was Father Kapaun. I didn't know who he was, because his helmet was all dirty, and you couldn't see the cross on it. And when it got dark, he routed us out of there and made us start walking. And Father Kapaun was hanging on to me, helping me along. Sometimes he'd carry me. Sometimes he'd put his arm around me, helping me hop on one leg. Because I didn't have a shoe on my wounded leg, and it was all open. There was no bandage or anything. And that's the way we went from there to prison camp. It was a long journey. But without him, I'd have never made it. God sent that man to me. I know just as well as I was born. If the Lord sent him and he obeyed what the Lord told him, to come straight across there where I was at, there's no other reason, none. Because he could have just well left and went the other way. So I give the Lord all the credit for saving my life, and he obeyed what the Lord told him to do. You'll never find another man like him, not on this side of heaven.
Father Kapaun and his men were marched north to a holding camp that became known as Kapaun's Valley, because of the number of men's lives that he was able to save on that forced march. From here, they would be marched further north under the cover of darkness. Temperatures reached 30 degrees below zero, and the men were in their summer uniforms, and many had no boots as they were taken by their North Korean captors. It was on this lengthy march north where Father Kapaun encouraged his fellow soldiers to carry the weak so they wouldn't be killed by their captors.
Father Emil would run back and forth just trying to convince these guys, come on, let's go, and try to convince the other guys who were able to walk, come on, let's pick these guys up, let's put them on a litter, we've got to somehow keep walking. And even though I have no doubt in my mind these guys all knew they were probably walking to their death, they probably all knew in their mind that where we're going, we're never going to be coming home again. And it's pretty evident when Father gave the guys the last rites of saying, a lot of you guys are not going to be making it home. And I think that's one of the things that endeared him so much to the guys in the camp and everybody that was around him, because he was honest by what he told them. He wasn't trying to sugarcoat it and tell them, oh, you guys are all going to be okay and we're all going to make it home, boys. It was a lot of you guys are not going to make it home, and I need to bless you now because this is going to be the last things you're probably going to see. But it was that honesty that also motivated people. You can still walk, pick up this guy that can't walk. You need to take him with you. He's your brother. He fought beside you too, so you need to make sure you take him along. And that's what kept inspiring people to go on, even though they knew, they were walking to their death.
He did that the whole way, the whole several days of this march from the schoolhouse to up where they were going to put us in camp.
Sometimes he would be helping others, And some of the other GIs would help me for a ways. Then he would come back and check, see where I was, and he would start carrying me then, helping me along on one foot.
He would always volunteer for the ration parties and would have us put up a little stir or something with the rations, and he'd sneak in and grab a whole bag. Then we'd have an extra, quite a bit of extra food to distribute. He said he would pray to St. Dismas, the great thief, and that was that kind of exercise was called for morally and as well as being good for everybody.
He didn't talk about being hungry or being thirsty or anything like that, which we were. It would have made it worse if we'd talked about it. Wherever he was, wherever he would say something, it would give you added strength. The strength that he had is phenomenal. I don't know what kept him going. The Lord had to keep him going, that's all it was.
He was one of the most selfless people you would ever run into. He was always thinking of others, and I could give you so many examples of how he just sacrificed his own self, even to the very end.
He tried to give everybody a reason to hang on, and it was just so terrible there. They'd seen all sorts of people die all around them in battle. They'd been overrun, annihilated. The survivors, some of them were wounded. And for weeks after that, and for months after that, the Chinese didn't give them very much food, so they were starving.
It was the winter of 1950 when the prisoners reached their final home, the Pyeongtaung prisoner of war camp. Starving and suffering through one of the coldest winters on record, nearly half of the prisoners would die that first winter.
One of the greatest ailments was dysentery. When you get dysentery, you're nauseous, you have diarrhea, you become dehydrated. When you get a bad case of it, you become so dehydrated that you cannot function.
With everybody on a margin like that, the will to live was everything. If somebody were to just decide to give up, he would be dead in the morning.
People were losing fingers and toes from overnight from frostbite. Plus they were sick, they were covered with lice, they were sleeping on the ground, and so they were just covered with lice, all of them.
The lice were a real problem. Dr. Sidney Essenson told me, or explained to me, he said, a lot of the men up there committed suicide. And he said it was very easy for them to commit suicide. He said all they had to do was to quit picking lice off their body. If they decide to quit picking the lice off their body, he said the first day it was all right because he said nobody would really notice it. He said that second day, he said you could see that they would start to get a little pale, but he said if they did not pick the lice off by the third day, he said that's when it was too late. He said that third day, he said they would just become ashen. He said they would become gray. And he said when it got to that state, he said there was nothing they could do. He said there was nothing I could do as a doctor. He said those men were going to die.
We had lice like you wouldn't believe. They would get in the seams of your clothes. They'd bite you and everything. I got little white marks on my arms where they've been bitten. Each one of them lice that you had on you would take a drop of blood almost. So you had to keep them off. It was terrible, them things.
He said time and time again, Father Kapaun would be there to try to instill hope in these men. He said those that were not able to do it themselves, he said those that were suffering from extreme cases of dysentery or those that were having other medical issues and couldn't do it themselves, he said Father Kapaun would go and do it for them. He said he insisted on the men thinking or realizing that they were going to be able to get out of there alive.
I could talk to a guy and he would be just like all the rest of us. And he'd just say, well, I can't put up with this another day. He'd go to bed that night and he'd be dead the next morning. To say how important the will to live is, I just can't overstate that. And that is where Father Kapaun played the biggest role. because it is he who would engender, under these worst conditions, a will to live among the soldiers.
In the camps that winter, deep in the valley, men could freeze to death in their sleep. Father Kapaun offered them his own clothes. They starved on tiny rations of millet and corn and birdseed. He somehow snuck past the guards, foraged in nearby fields, and returned with rice and potatoes. In desperation, some men hoarded food. He convinced them to share. Their bodies were ravaged by dysentery. He grabbed some rocks, pounded metal into pots, and boiled clean water. They lived in filth. He washed their clothes, and he cleansed their wounds.
He would take these clothes that he had cleaned, and he would take them to the people who were beyond helping themselves, and he would help them. He would give them clean clothes. He would pick the lice off their body. He would do whatever was needed to straighten them out, give them a chance to keep going.
The guards ridiculed his devotion to his Savior and the Almighty. They took his clothes and made him stand in the freezing cold for hours, yet he never lost his faith. If anything, it only grew stronger. At night, he slipped into huts to lead prisoners in prayer, saying the rosary, administering the sacraments, offering 3 simple words: God bless you. One of them later said that with his very presence, he could, just for a moment, turn a mud hut into a cathedral.
Just for him to be there, that gave you hope. That's the only hope you had. You didn't hear anything. We didn't know maybe the Chinese pushed Americans right off in Korea. We never heard a thing. And so any hope you could get come from him.
Father Kapaun himself became ill with dysentery, was suffering from pneumonia, and had a blood clot in his lower leg which turned it black and twice its normal size. Even with those ailments, he never stopped looking out for the physical and spiritual needs of his fellow soldiers. His communist captors rarely allowed Father Kapaun to lead faith services, and Easter service 1951 would be his last.
On that particular Sunday, it had been strictly forbidden to give the service. Soldiers had been posted to keep him from doing it. And we all just walked in there and pushed, Father just leading the pack, just kind of pushed the soldiers aside. They were hollering at him the whole time. He paid no attention to them, and started and gave the service.
And he read from a prayer missal that they had kept hidden. He held up a small crucifix that he had made from sticks. And as the guards watched, Father Kapaun and all those prisoners, men of different faith, perhaps some men of no faith, sang the Lord's Prayer and America the Beautiful. They sang so loud that other prisoners across the camp not only heard them, they joined in too, filling that valley with song and with prayer.
The sound was picked up as it went down the valley, and you could hear the huts as it moved down being picked up by the GIs all through the valley.
It gives you a good feeling to know that it was Easter, and what happened on Easter. Christ arose, went back to heaven. So Father Kapaun, he did his duty.
One of the things that was kind of phenomenal was and it was just an artifact of the situation, I know, but the way the light shone on him, it really was remarkable. It was like he was being lit up from above. And some people claim it was a halo, but it was I didn't see any halos. But it was a really a surreal lighting of him as he gave his sermon.
That faith that they might be delivered from evil, that they could make it home, was perhaps the greatest gift to those men. that even amidst such hardship and despair, there could be hope. Amid their misery in the temporal, they could see those truths that are eternal.
He didn't care for himself. He was always interested in helping others, helping his fellow man, somebody that was in need of help or somebody that was down spiritually or something. He was there to build them up. He took care of his fellow man rather than himself. He was strong on that, taking care of somebody else.
Yet for Father Kapaun, the horrific conditions took their toll. Thin, frail, he began to limp, the blood clot in his leg. Then came dysentery, then pneumonia. That's when the guards saw their chance to finally rid themselves of this priest in the hope he inspired. They came for him, and over the protests and tears of the men who loved him, the guards sent him to a death house, a hellhole with no food or water to be left to die.
Robert Wood was one of the men that carried Father Kapaun to the death house, and he said, of course, he said, tears were streaming down from our eyes. He said, when they came to take him away, he said, we all stood up and we were all ready to fight. And he said, but Father Kapaun had a moment of clarity. They said that he came out of his sleep, and he told them, he said, stop. He said, don't fight. He said, it's all right. He said, let them take me away.
By then I was crying, and he said to me, Mike, don't cry on my behalf. I'm going where I always wanted to go. And when I get there, I'll be saying a prayer for all of you.
To Ralph Nardella, he said, Ralph, you know the prayers. You've prayed with me. He said, you make sure the people pray. You make sure the men pray. To others, he told them to go on and continue to steal food, continue to get food for the men.
In all that he told us, he was telling us to carry on, not to carry on his spirit there in the camp. And so he really not only gave you a spirit, but another incentive to keep going.
And then as he was taken away, he did something remarkable. He blessed the guards. Forgive them, he said, for they know not what they do.
The soldiers were amazed that Father Kapaun was asking forgiveness from this communist guard, but it was in reflection that they recognized how difficult it was for Father Kapaun to love those who had mistreated him and the other inmates in that prisoner of war camp. How can one not but see the face of Christ in that example? That Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. His life is truly, from birth to death, a great example of one who had committed his life to Christ and who now continues to inspire us in that message that he lived and believed and he died so that we might have eternal life through Christ our Lord.
What Christ used to do when he was on earth, Father Kapaun did the same thing, helping his fellow man, caring for the lowly down and that needed help. He was there.
2 days later, in that house of death, Father Kapaun breathed his last breath. His body was taken away, his grave unmarked, his remains unrecovered to this day.
You know, you felt like you'd been kicked in the stomach, and even though he was gone, we knew amongst ourselves he won't be suffering anymore. And that hope that he instilled in us will never go away.
The war and the awful captivity would drag on for another 2 years. But these men held on, steeled by the memory and moral example of the man they called Father. And on their first day of freedom, in his honor, they carried that beautiful wooden crucifix with them. I'm told that in their darkest hours in the camp, in that valley, these men turned to psalm. As we prepare for the presentation of the Medal of Honor to Father Kapaun's nephew Ray, I want to leave you with the words of that psalm, which sustained these men all those years ago. Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love would follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to Chaplain Emil J. Kapaun, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Chaplain Emil J. Kapaun distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty.
The Medal of Honor given to Father Kapaun in 2012 completes every award that can be given, and now Father Kapaun is the most decorated military chaplain in the U.S. history. In the church, many are praying for and clamoring for Father Emil to be declared a saint. This process is done exceedingly slowly but exceedingly fine. This is done to make sure that the life of the individual who is being investigated is truly one worthy, of which no one is really worthy, of the title of canonized saint. That investigation has been ongoing for several years, and it is hoped that the Positio, which is the official position paper, will be presented to Rome in the beginning part of 2015. No military chaplain has been canonized a saint, and there are only 7 individuals in the history of the United States who have been canonized. There are only 19 individuals in the United States that have been given the title Servant of God, of which Father Emil is one of those individuals. And so many people are recognizing how the life of heroism, the life of fidelity, the life of faith inspires others. And so the title of Servant of God is that first step. And then the next would be the beatification based upon the miracles that are attributed to the intercession of Father Kapaun. And then the third would be the actual canonization of Father Kapaun. And that's what we pray may one day happen if it be God's will.
You've just learned a tremendous amount about a man who the church and our country is hailing as a role model for men. And what I'd say to you is, as you anticipate the next 6 weeks, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of fear that creeps into our hearts at that kind of commitment. But what I would tell you is that once we give ourselves to something noble, the deliverance of it is beautiful. And so my invitation for you, as we begin today and begin to look forward to the next 6 weeks, is for you to step into this with everything you have. And for you to step as men in community, to hold the guy sitting next to you and the guy behind you and the guy in front of you, and make sure that for the next 6 weeks, you know where they are, and that is here. I'm going to end each time we come together with a challenge. And I'm going to ask you for the 5 or 6 days in between these meetings that you do this challenge with everything you have, and that you check in with the men that are watching this to make sure they are as well. Today's challenge is a simple devotion that Father Kapaun himself taught us. And the devotion is to pray 3 Hail Marys in the morning and 3 Hail Marys each evening. And I would say to you, when you pray those 3 Hail Marys, ask for an increase in faith, hope, and love. Those 3 great virtues, not just in yourself, but in your home, in your business, in your church, and in our communities. Because if we're gonna say yes to God as a group of men, and if we are truly gonna live in the spirit of Father Kapaun, we have to believe first and foremost that those 3 great virtues are virtues that are attainable, and when we start to live those virtues, it's those virtues that begin to change this world. And so what I would say to you is, allow Father Kapaun to pray for you. Know that I'm praying for you, and there are men all over this country who've come together for a cause much greater than our own, and that is to become one of Kapaun's men. So welcome.